مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. السياسة في أمريكا تكون دائما لعبة صعبة وعنيفة. كما يذكرون مشهد رئيس في مسرحية برودواي الناجحة هاملتون، كان هناك وقت في تاريخنا قتل فيه النائب السابق الرئيس الولايات المتحدة وزير الخزانة السابق في مبارزة بينهما. ولكن هل الوضع أسوأ اليوم؟ هل يستحيل حكم أمريكا؟ هل زادت قوة انقسامنا الحزبي وصارت أعمق وأكبر من أخدود جراند كانيون؟ هل ثمة حل؟ ضيفنا هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن هو المؤلف السياسي السابق في قناة CNN, Bill Schneider. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. For years, experts have been saying that we are in a period more partisan, divided, and tribal in American politics than ever before. But is our system truly broken? Is it beyond repair? For this, we will discuss American politics with Bill Schneider, one of the best. Bill, thank you very much for being on Dakhel Washington.
My pleasure.
So, Bill, in this fantastic new book, Standoff, you make a suggestion, an argument, that America is now becoming ungovernable. What does that mean, and how could that possibly be the case?
We require government by compromise, and compromise has become more and more difficult because of what you just said, because of tribalism, which has gotten worse and worse. I teach at a university here in Washington, and a student once asked me a question. He said, a young man, he said, "Is this the most divided we've ever been as a country?" And I said, "You know, young man, we once had a civil war." That was way back a long time, 150 years ago, and I don't think that we're anywhere near that level of division. But the fact is, I think we're the most divided we've been since the Civil War, and there's no immediate prospect for bringing the country together.
And with those divisions, what actually makes it impossible to govern?
The divisions are divisions of values, not interests. 50, 60 years ago, the division was mostly if you supported business, you were a Republican. If you supported labor, you were a Democrat. You could make deals, you could compromise, you could negotiate. Today, it's differences over what's right and what's wrong, over moral issues. Many of them are religious issues, on issues like abortion. You can't make deals on those kinds of issues because they're matters of right and wrong. And presidents who try don't succeed. You know, Bill Clinton was asked once by a Tea Party follower, this was after he left the presidency, the woman said, "Mr. Clinton, I don't believe in compromising. Compromise means selling out." And Clinton turned to her and he said, "Madam, read the Constitution. It might as well be called, let's make a deal."
Now, let's take a step back. You describe two Americas, an old America and a new America. Explain to our viewers what you mean by these terms.
These are two large constituencies in this country that differ demographically. The old America is older, more male, white, tends to live in rural areas. The new America is young, minority. A lot of them are immigrants, and they have only begun to acquire political identity really since the 1960s. And their values are very different from the old America. They're more progressive. They have different views of how the sexes should relate, how minority groups should relate, and they are in a really battle to the death that's shaping American politics right now.
I mean, wouldn't a skeptic say, "Oh, come on, young people have always wanted more free love, liberties to do things than their parents and grandparents"? What makes this division today different than divisions in the past?
It's political. You had that in the 20s. You had flappers and you had bathtub gin and you had young people in revolt against traditional religion and things like that. That was then. Now it's really political because it started with politics in the 60s. The debate over civil rights, the debate over the Vietnam War, those things were deeply political. You know, other countries had a lot of trouble in the 60s too, but they got over it. China had a great tragedy, the great proletarian cultural revolution. Probably 1 million people died and were uprooted because of that. But they got over it. They treat it the way Americans treat our Civil War, as a historical memory. Today, Americans are still fighting their Civil War from the 1960s because we haven't gotten over it.
So you're suggesting that there are these fundamental issues of values. Right. So it's not about race or economics or traditional interests. It's about values and what goes to the heart of what makes a person tick?
What's right and wrong, that's what values are all about. There are two things that drive people's politics: their values and their interests. Sometimes they come into conflict. And when they do, values usually prevail over interests. A very well-received book was written in 2004 by an author named Thomas Frank. What's the Matter with Kansas, it was called. He pointed out that Kansas is a state of mostly white, working class men and women. A lot of them are farmers. And that was the heartbed of populism around the turn of the 20th century. A great leader in Kansas, Mary Lease, said farmers should raise less corn and more hell. And Kansas was purely populist. Today it's one of the most conservative states in the Union. What happened? Kansans are deeply religious, many of them, many of those voters. And they have conservative moral and religious values. They don't like what they saw happening to the country since the 1960s. And they had a tremendous backlash. You saw it in the Goldwater movement, in the Nixon movement, in the Reagan movement. There was a backlash to the changes that the country was experiencing. So what happened is those people who used to vote their economic interests now vote their conservative, mostly religious values. You also find groups at the top, like Jewish American voters, who vote overwhelmingly Democratic, even though their interests should be Republican. Many of them are business and professional people whose economic interests are most compatible with the Republican Party. Many are strong supporters of Israel, and any Israeli will tell you the Republican Party is better for Israel than the Democrats. But yet, Democrats voted 75%.
Jews voted for.
I'm sorry, Jews voted 75% for Hillary Clinton, and they voted 79% for Democrats in the 2018 midterm. So they too vote their values over their interests.
You describe a fascinating phenomenon in this book, one among many, which is that it's not just polls that matter, it's really the intensity of belief. Namely, minorities can get their way in our country, even if a majority holds it, by definition, will hold a different view on an issue, a minority can win out. How does that process work?
It's what we call voting issues. Often there's a minority that feels so intensely about the issue, sometimes it's anti-abortion, sometimes it's in favor of gun rights, that they don't care what else a politician or a candidate says. They'll vote against or for the candidate wholly on the basis of that one issue. That gives them power. It means if you defy what they want and say support gun controls, they'll vote against you for that reason alone, and they don't care what else you say. That issue is an issue that drives their vote. There are a few issues that do that, and when they do that, they tend to have control over the agenda because it means that politicians don't want to take any chances in offending that constituency because they know that if they do, they're going to lose a certain number of votes.
Is that a fairly recent phenomenon in our politics?
Well, I'd say since the 1960s, that's been a real phenomenon, since the political consciousness of women, gun owners, a lot of different groups has emerged and been strengthened. So it is, if you want to call 50 or 60 years recent, that's how recent it is.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about specific elections that were pivotal in the last 50, 60 years. And then I'm going to ask you what we need to do to fix these problems in just a moment. Our guest today is William Bill Schneider. Bill is one of the best known and most widely respected political analysts in America. He served as CNN's senior political analyst for nearly 2 decades and has covered every U.S. presidential and midterm election since 1976 for the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic Monthly, CNN, and Al Jazeera. Currently, he is a distinguished senior fellow at Third Way, a Washington think tank, and professor at George Mason University's School of Public Policy. And he is the author of this provocative and compelling new book called Standoff: How America Became Ungovernable. So, Bill, let's talk about pivotal elections. You identified really historic turns. What would you say is the most pivotal election of the last 50, 60 years?
Probably 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan. I go through all the elections really that I covered, going back even as far as 1964 when I was in college, and we had a mock Republican convention, something you couldn't do at most colleges anymore. But the 1980 election was pivotal because when Ronald Reagan was elected, he really reshaped American politics. He adopted a hardline conservative platform, yet he governed not as an aggressive and nasty campaigner. Americans loved him. Americans admired him. But yet he had a very big role in dividing the country.
Take that one sentence further. How did Ronald Reagan, Morning in America, end up dividing Americans?
Because he embraced very conservative values. He developed a movement based on those values, and there was a backlash to those values, which became really the Democratic Party. That was the division over values, perfectly stated. We call them social issues, issues like abortion rights, issues like gay rights, issues like school prayer. These are often religious issues that are deeply divisive in the United States. You know, before Donald Trump, we had 4 presidents in a row who got elected on a promise to heal the country, to bring the country together. You had Ronald Reagan's successor, the first President Bush, who said he would be kinder and gentler. He was fired after 1 term. You had Bill Clinton, who was a new Democrat, and the third way, who reoriented the Democratic Party to the center. He got impeached. You had the second George Bush, who promised to be a uniter, not a divider. Well, after the Iraq War, the country was more divided than ever. And then you had Barack Obama, who said there's no liberal America and no conservative America. There's only the United States of America. He was proved wrong. Donald Trump is unusual because he's not a healer. He saw the division of the country and he said, I can exploit this. He's a businessman. He knows how to exploit things that he sees. So he decided, I'm going to take advantage of this division, and he ran and is governing as a divider. He takes advantage of that division.
So would we be having this conversation if 75,000 votes had been different in 2016 and Donald Trump hadn't come out victorious?
Well, the division would still be there, but I don't think it would be quite as intense because Trump epitomizes the division. The division was there. Look, you had the Clinton wars in the 90s. You had the debate over Iraq. You had a lot of division over Barack Obama. But the fact is that Donald Trump does something no other American president has ever done. He deliberately divides the country. Lots of presidents have been divisive. But to go out and deliberately divide the country, to pit one side against another, that's new. And it's created an era of bad feeling here in the United States and really piqued the intensity of the conflict that's been around for a long time.
So when you look at the Republican Party under Donald Trump, has it, in your view, become Donald Trump's party? Or are all the pieces of the party that were there under George H.W. and George W., are they still there waiting for the post-Trump moment?
He owns the Republican Party at this point. It's been amazing to see him getting 80%, 90% approval from his fellow Republicans. A few years ago, we didn't even know he was a Republican. But he has captured the anger of the conservative base. He's an unusual politician. He doesn't care about swing voters. He doesn't care about the middle. He only cares about firing up his base, marching them to the polls and getting them to overwhelm the other side. That's a very divisive style of politics, and it's uniquely Trump because, as I said, no other president has set out deliberately to divide the country. Not even Abraham Lincoln, who was president at a time when America was more deeply divided, but he saw his mission as healing the country.
And how much of this do you think is unique to Donald Trump? And how much do you think outlives Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, even if Donald Trump loses, he'll still have a movement behind him, I think. The Republican establishment, which he defeated soundly, the nominee was supposed to be Jeb Bush, but he defeated the Republican establishment. They're still around. They're licking their wounds. They dare not defy Donald Trump because he can have revenge on them. He controls probably a majority of most Republican primaries, and those voters will punish anyone who criticizes or offends Donald Trump. It's his army. And he'll keep that army with him even if he were to lose. In fact, if he loses in 2020 and his ratings are very poor, I don't know if he's going to leave office easily or willingly. He'll probably have to be pushed out because he'll claim it was all fraud. It was all because of stolen votes and illegal immigrants voting. It's going to be difficult to get rid of Donald Trump. And even if he's out of power, he'll have a lot of political influence.
All right, so where do we go from here? You've described a pretty bleak situation in American politics, not quite Civil War bleak, but next thing to it. How does it get fixed? Is it a knight on a white horse or something more structural?
Look, American politics, American government was designed not to work very well. That's the way the Constitution was written, because it was written by people who didn't want strong government. A parliamentary system gives you strong government. Ours does not. It means there's divisions, there's checks and balances. Very hard to govern the United States because it's easy to stop things from happening, as Mr. Trump is finding out. Well, how do we get out of this? How do we solve problems? We always have. Our system of government actually does work very well despite the odds. The reason is public opinion. If there is a crisis facing Americans and people recognize it as a real crisis, then suddenly all the barriers disappear. The branches of government work together because there's an overwhelming mandate to solve this problem, to get something done. That's what happened in the 1930s with the Depression. It happened after 9/11 with the attacks on the United States. It happened in the Civil Rights crisis. It happened in the economic crisis of the 1970s. American government works very well in a crisis, but it does require a crisis. And right now there are some things that some people think should be crises, like climate change, like the national debt, but to most voters, they're not important enough yet for them to react as if they were crises.
So we really need a life or death set of issues to compel these warring parties, these tribes in American politics to overcome their differences?
A crisis is the way I would put it. Life and death is a little strong, but a crisis.
A crisis.
A real crisis, and we have them frequently. There was an economic crisis when Obama got elected, and he got to do some things that otherwise would be impossible, like a $1 trillion economic stimulus program. That would have been impossible to get through Congress, except for the fact that there was a feeling of overwhelming urgency. When the public feels overwhelming urgency, they say to politicians, you better fix this or you're going to be out. And suddenly politicians know their interest and they respond.
All right, so let me ask you a counterintuitive question. Despite this pretty dark picture, what's the best news in American politics today? The most hopeful news?
Well, I don't know if this is hopeful, but let's say that Americans see through Donald Trump. He has a constituency. It's maybe 25 to 30% of the voters, but most voters don't like him. And given his numbers, he is unlikely to be reelected. How did he get elected in the first place? A lot of Democrats stayed home in 2016. Number one, they didn't really like Hillary Clinton. They thought she was a status quo candidate. They thought she was the charter member of the Washington establishment, which in a way she was. And second of all, they didn't think she needed their vote. They said, all the polls say she's going to win. She doesn't need my vote. So they just stayed home in large numbers all around the country. I don't think that'll happen if Donald Trump is on the ballot in 2020.
Well, since we know he's likely to be the Republican candidate, what is your advice to the great Democratic question? Should the party nominate a firebrand on the left to get the base excited, or a more moderate candidate to appeal to that great American middle?
Well, there are arguments for both of those positions. Do they want a Democratic Donald Trump, someone who's tough and aggressive and nasty? That could have been, might have been Michael Avenatti until he dropped out of the race. He was the attorney for Stormy Daniels, the porn star who accuses Donald Trump of paying her off, or trying to pay her off. He actually did pay her off. The other alternative would be to nominate an un-Trump, someone completely different from Donald Trump. That's what usually happens in American politics. Voters look for someone who offers them something they want that they're not getting from the incumbent. Way back in 1960, John Kennedy offered youth, dynamism, vigor, the youngest president we've ever elected. Eisenhower, who was the president at the time, was old, he was infirm, and people thought the country was slowing down after the Soviets launched Sputnik. Look, after Richard Nixon and Watergate, we elected a Sunday school teacher, Jimmy Carter, who seemed to come out of nowhere but promised, I will never lie to you. After George H.W. Bush seemed out of touch with the American people, Bill Clinton offered empathy. I feel your pain. Barack Obama was the un-Bush, I mean, very different from Bush's son. He was the un-Bush. That's what got him elected. And Donald Trump is certainly the un-Obama. You can't imagine any political figure as different from Barack Obama as Donald Trump. So my guess is the Democrats are going to probably look for someone who offers something people want that they're not getting from President Trump. And my answer to that question is one word: civility. Someone who can be civil, because the one word you do not associate with Donald Trump is civility.
Bill Schneider, thank you so much for being on Dachel, Washington.
It's very crowded here. There's a lot of housing issues, but it's a good place to live. It's just hard to find a place to live.
Lots of fun stuff to do. Lots of good restaurants. We've got like unique places like hole-in-the-wall restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
So we appreciate the culture.
Yeah. How about something that you think is broken in Washington? Something that isn't working well?
A lot of
The
things.
roads.
Yeah, the roads is a big one. The roads are not in very good repair at all.
And the metro. Metro's had a lot of issues.
I come from the smallest state in America, Rhode Island, one of the 13 original colonies. We're famous around the world as one of the birthplaces of religious liberty. We were founded by a preacher, Roger Williams, who left the tight control of religious zealots in next-door Massachusetts, looking for a place where he could lead a congregation in ways of their own choosing. Ever since, my state has welcomed immigrants seeking freedom. First Italians and Irish and East European Jews. When I was growing up, the influx was from Portugal and the Azore Islands. More recently, Vietnamese. Historically, we're also one of the most democratic states in the Union. We voted for Dukakis over Bush, Carter over Ford, and almost Mondale over Reagan. If a Democrat can't win in Rhode Island, there aren't many places in America where he can win. But we weren't always totally blue. For 31 straight years, one of our two senators was a Republican, John Chafee, then his son Lincoln. I didn't always agree with either father or son, but in retrospect, the fact that we could send one Republican and one Democrat to the most exclusive club in America, the United States Senate, said a lot about the broad-minded, inclusive people of my home state. Sadly, that broad-mindedness and inclusiveness is disappearing, not just there, but around the country. Expert after expert underscores the growing tribalism of American politics. With cable news and websites that cater to specific political trends, we share less and less with people with whom we disagree. We don't even share the same facts, let alone the same analysis or recommendations. The result is that we are growing apart, precisely at a moment when we need national consensus more than any time I can remember. Is it fatal to the American experiment? No, I don't think so. A country that fought a bloody civil war 150 years ago is not about to see its institutions collapse today. But pulling back from the brink requires a conscious effort, especially on the part of our leaders. The institutions our founders devised are as strong and resilient today as when they were created. What we need are men and women who are broad-minded and inclusive, who are strong and resilient to make those institutions work. I believe it can happen, but it won't be by magic. It takes real work, so let's roll up our sleeves and make it happen. Behava nasilu el-nehet hal-halka min barnamij Dachel, Washington. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول مستقبل نظام الحزبين في أمريكا أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على #InsideWashington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.